living La Vida low carb. This show is changing lives. We talking about your diet, trying to get you feeling right. Cut up them avocados, fry some eggs, time to explore the longest running health podcast, hosted by Jimmy Moore. Time to give up the crappy garbage, we're getting into ketosis. Every day is a new step to your goal, yeah, you're getting closer. Motivated and focused, don't stop, just go. Time to get inspiration from the Living La Vida Low Carb Show. Hey, the livinglowcarbshow.com.
So today, you guys, I have another brand new study all about the ketogenic diet, and this one's really fascinating. I think a lot of times people look at the ketogenic diet and they think, oh, that's good for weight loss, that's good for, whatever. They come up with whatever the things they think it's good for. And what they never take into account is all the ancillary ways that a ketogenic diet helps. Well, I have a brand new study in my hands right here, and it's from the good folks at Virta Health. So if you haven't heard about Virta Health, Virta, they have been doing some fantastic research, and it's got some of the all-stars in kind of the ketogenic world. People like Dr. Phinney, who is just the godfather of researching ketogenic diet. Since the 80s, he's been researching the ketogenic diet. Jim McCarter, who I've had on my podcast, Dr. Sarah Hallberg, same thing. And just lots of good people. So this was published, you guys, in the Journal of Behavioral Medicine, and it came out January 27th, 2022. So this is literally right off the presses just a week or two ago. And the title of the paper, Depressive Symptoms Improve Over 2 Years of Type 2 Diabetes Treatment via a Digital Continuous Remote Care Intervention focused on carbohydrate restriction. Now keep in mind, the Virta Health people have been doing research, long-term research on type 2 diabetics on a ketogenic diet, trying to see what happens, what changes happen. So this is just the latest in a whole line of studies. I've read a couple of their studies before, so this is not the very first one, but it's the latest one. Abstract. Depressive symptoms are prevalent among people with type 2 diabetes, and even at low severity levels are associated with worse diabetes outcomes. And that's true. When a type 2 diabetic gets depressed, it's because they're stressed, and or the depression then leads to the stress, which then can raise their blood sugar, which then impacts their diabetes. So they're right, even in a mild case, it can make it worse. Carbohydrate restriction is an effective treatment for type 2 diabetes, but its long-term impacts on depressive symptoms are unclear. In the current study, we explored changes in depressive symptoms over a 2-year period. They had 262 primarily non-depressed type 2 diabetic patients participating in a continuous remote care intervention, which emphasized carbohydrate restriction. Subclinical depressive symptoms decreased over the first 10 weeks, and reductions were maintained all the way through the entire 2 years. Increased frequency of blood ketone levels indicated that there was adherence to the low-carb eating plan, and it predicted decreases in the symptoms of depression. Concerns have been raised with recommending restrictive diets due to the potential negative impact on quality of life factors, things like mood. However, results of the current study support positive rather than negative long-term impacts of closely monitored carbohydrate restriction on depressive symptoms. And they're so right, by the way. When I first started on the Atkins diet circa 18 years ago, one of the big monikers about a low-carb diet, an Atkins diet, was, oh, you'll just be angry all the time and you'll be very moody. I never really understood that, especially in my own personal experience doing a ketogenic, low-carb kind of approach. It was just the opposite. I was finally getting to eat bacon. I was finally getting to have full-fat meats and cheeses and all these so-called forbidden foods that I could never have on a low-fat diet. And so I never understood the whole idea that, well, when you eat low-carb, it'll make you angry, it'll make you moody. And I'm like, I was chill AF. What are you talking about? And so I never understood that one, and he's right. The authors of this paper are right. They just got it wrong. They predicted that your mood would go sour, and actually it goes the opposite direction. I can tell you now, I am so chill. I am so relaxed. I'm so calm in my brain because of the ketones. And that's the power of eating for nutritional ketosis, is you don't really have those kind of issues. All right, let's get into the study itself. Introduction. In the United States, over 30 million people have diabetes, which is recognized amongst the leading causes of morbidity and mortality. Treatment of type 2 diabetes usually involves recommendations of significant lifestyle changes. And when those prove insufficient, medications are prescribed to manage the disease and slow the progression. However, many patients fail to maintain their glycemic targets after initiation of diabetes medications, in which doses will continue to increase and additional medications are often required. Medications contribute to patient burden in terms of the costs involved, side effects such as weight gain, and an increased risk of potentially life-threatening hypoglycemia. Furthermore, patients often have unfavorable views of all the medications they have to take, the so-called polypharmacy, and treatment intensification, especially with regards to the initiation of having to use insulin. So they're talking about how it's miserable. If you get type 2 diabetes and you go through the traditional care, it's a miserable experience. And everybody knows that, which has always been funny to me, that we don't give a closer look at carbohydrate restriction with its efficacy for type 2 diabetes, in light of the fact that quality of care outside of that and in the norm of what standard of care is for treating it is horrible. It's terrible. And yet we keep doing the same thing over and over again, expecting a different result. It's insane, right? The burden of diabetes treatment is also associated with emotional distress amongst those individuals with type 2 diabetes. Depression, elevations in subclinical depressive symptoms are much more common amongst individuals who have type 2 diabetes compared to those who don't. Treatment with insulin therapy is associated with an increased risk for depressive symptoms in those with type 2 diabetes, suggesting that intensive treatment contributes to the emotional distress. I think we have forgotten that mental health is still a part of health. And this is why they get away with doing this traditional kind of treatment for type 2 diabetes. They are treating it as if it's only a physical health issue. I don't have type 2 diabetes, so I can't speak to this personally, but if I did, and all the things that I did were the quote right things to do still weren't working to help me, I would be depressed. I would be, what's wrong with me? Why isn't this working? What's happening to me? And we have to admit that that's a reality. And then you go on all these medications and all the burden of having to pay for the medications, especially if you don't have like insurance for pharmaceuticals, you know, at some point that's going to catch up to you. It just makes you wonder, why don't they have a heart for the patient if they truly are trying to, quote, first do no harm? Isn't that harming them? Messing with their mental health? I think so. Furthermore, depressive symptoms are associated with worse self-management. They miss medical appointments. They don't adhere to the medications. They don't really track their blood sugar levels. And their health outcomes, things like hyperglycemia, very high blood sugar, diabetes-related complications, and then mortality. These impacts are not restricted to people with a depression diagnosis. Even amongst those people with relatively low levels of depressive symptoms, the number and or severity of these symptoms are incrementally associated with a poorer diabetes self-management. So based on this evidence, current guidelines for the psychosocial care of individuals with diabetes emphasize the importance of identifying and addressing depression and diabetes-related emotional distress as a standard of comprehensive diabetes care, as it should be. We should be giving these patients hope and help and not leaving them to flounder. There has been much research dedicated to understanding the relationship between depressive symptoms and diabetes. The nature and directionality of the depression-diabetes relationship is hotly debated, but evidence points to a bi-directional relationship with both behavioral and physiological mechanisms. For example, pathophysiological alterations like disturbance of your circadian rhythm, pro-inflammatory processes, and then the real funky monkey one, hang with me on this one, hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis dysregulation. That means a lot's going on. So it's not good. Related all to insulin resistance are common to people who have depression and type 2 diabetes. Additionally, high rates of depression and emotional distress could be attributed to the stress of living with diabetes itself. There's a fear of the progression. There's fear of complications and having an amputation down the road. There's the day-to-day burden of having to manage this and test your blood sugar and make sure that you're keeping up with, if you take insulin, enough insulin to cover the foods that you eat. All of these lead to a lot of emotional distress. Carbohydrate restriction as a treatment for type 2 diabetes. Sustained dietary carbohydrate restriction is recognized as an alternative to increased pharmacological treatment of type 2 diabetes in the standards of medical care. And that's true. They note the American Diabetes Association in 2021 changed the guidelines for people with type 2 diabetes. If this is news to you, please go talk to your doctor. Have them look up 2021 American Diabetes Association guidelines for treating type 2 diabetes. You now have an option to do carbohydrate restriction. Now, your doctor may not have gotten the memo. Your doctor may still be stuck in the old standard of care, but the new standard of care allows them to put you on a low-carb ketogenic diet as an alternative to all that other stuff that they've always pushed. We know that low-carb diets have consistently elicited improvements in HbA1c, weight, inflammation, and cardiovascular risk factors while reducing reliance on all the anti-glycemic medications. Despite evidence for improved diabetes outcomes up to 1 and 2 years, questions have been raised about the sustainability of this low-carb approach based on concerns related to the burden of adhering to a restrictive diet and the potential negative impact on the patient's well-being. However, the impact of carbohydrate restriction on well-being in type 2 diabetes is understudied. And they're right. There have been a lot of assumptions made about ketogenic diets over the years. And guys, I've been around almost 2 decades. I have heard everything under the sun said about carbohydrate restriction. I mean, everything. And when I first came on the scene in 2005, after I lost weight in 2004 on the Atkins diet, man, you should have seen the onslaught of how they tried to mire and taint the low-carb diet. I was just like, why? Like, what's the point? It's helping some people. Okay, you don't happen to like it, but that's irrelevant if there are people seeing benefits from it. I never have understood why there's such a vitriol, other than, yes, the obvious, the pharmaceutical companies are losing patients and customers if people get off of medication. So I get that aspect of it. But just from a medical standpoint, trying to help your patient get better, wouldn't you want to give them every option on the table? I think so. Carbohydrate restriction and mood. A burgeoning literature does not support any negative impact of carbohydrate restriction on your mood. In fact, there is a small but growing literature that focuses on potential mood stabilizing factors of the diet, particularly amongst those individuals who have bipolar. When I wrote Keto Clarity, you guys, one of the things that I put in there that we have emerging science on is that it helps with bipolar disease. And so they're right. We've known that. Those studies are already out there. Researchers theorize that changes in the brain, for example, the switch from utilizing to utilizing ketones for energy instead of glucose, could be what's affecting mood. Well, yeah, those ketones directly feeding the brain, ketone bodies are the preferred fuel source for the brain. So it makes sense that all of the things that would exacerbate brain health and cause your mood to be in a depressive state would switch once you change fuel sources for said brain. It makes so much sense. Why isn't this common knowledge? In addition, a handful of studies have explored the impact of a low-carb diet on mood and other psychological outcomes amongst patients without mental health conditions or without diabetes. The majority of those studies identified either modest improvements or no change in their mood or other indicators of psychological well-being. There have been a few longitudinal studies identified short-term improvement followed by regression back to baseline mood. However, there are many reasons to expect that a low-carbohydrate diet could have a positive effect on mood in those people who have type 2 diabetes and other metabolic conditions. First, higher glucose and inflammation are linked to metabolic syndrome, diabetes, and depression. Isn't that interesting? So just the mere presence of higher blood sugar and higher inflammation levels actually links the connection between metabolic syndrome, diabetes, and depression. If you're one of those people who suffers from depression and you happen to have metabolic syndrome and you happen to have diabetes, have you ever made this connection before? Has any doctor ever brought this to your attention that, hey, you're depressed because the diabetes is out of control. Let's get the inflammation down. Let's do things that are anti-inflammatory. Let's get that glucose under control. And this is why I know more people would buy into the keto message if they heard that from a medical professional. And I've literally never heard this association before, which is great that they did a study on this. Thus, improvements in glucose and inflammation observed with a low-carbohydrate diet could have a very positive influence on those depressive symptoms. For example, data from the Diabetes Prevention Program suggests that it is not the diagnosis of diabetes that increases the risk for depression, but rather increases in your HbA1c and fasting blood glucose level that follow the diagnosis. Isn't that interesting? It's not the diagnosis itself. It's those increases in the blood sugar that follow the diagnosis that leads to the depressive symptoms. It's all connected. And look, if you know somebody in your life who has type 2 diabetes and they're dealing with out of control blood sugars and they're dealing with depression and they keep, especially if you're like a coach of clients and patients, and they keep coming to you, I just feel so bad, I just feel so horrible. Well, here's why. You're high blood pressure, you're high inflammation. So let me help you get those things under control and watch your depressive symptoms get better. It's a good buy-in factor for those of you that coach people and have patients. Furthermore, improvements in the HbA1c have been associated with decreased depressive symptoms in adults with type 2 diabetes. Second, the majority of people with type 2 diabetes also have obesity, so the whole diabesity pandemic that we have. And the low-carbohydrate diet is associated with clinically significant long-term weight loss, substantial weight loss, such as that experienced following bariatric surgery, is also associated with an improvement in depressive symptoms. So there's an argument for lose weight, and that also will help with the depression. Third, a low-carb diet tends to reduce dependence on all the anti-glycemic medications, which is aligned with patient preferences and avoids negative secondary consequences of these intensive therapy regimens, including the risk of hypoglycemia and a reduced well-being. Look, nobody wants to take medications. Yes, I know there's some people who say, I would rather do the medication than do the lifestyle change you're recommending, but I think for the most part, most people would rather not have to take any drugs at all. A few small studies have examined changes in psychological well-being among people with pre-diabetes or type 2 diabetes in the context of a low-carb diet. Results were mixed, with some indicating psychological well-being, being in diabetes distress, as they call it, improving, and then others saying it just stayed the same. However, the sample size in those studies were so small and time limited that carbohydrate restriction may have reduced the power for these analyses of the secondary outcomes. Did you go keto and thought you had to give up wine? Well, let me introduce you to Dry Farm Wines. It is the world's first sugar-free alcohol that is lower than your typical wines, organic, made at local farms that do it the right way. Most of the wines that you buy are from 3 really big companies, loaded with additives and preservatives, so many dozens of those kinds of things. You don't want all that junk in your wine. So go to dryfarmwines.com/Jimmy and they will ship you these wines. And just because you listen to this podcast, Dry Farm Wines is going to give you a bottle in your first order for just 1 cent. Go to dryfarmwines.com/Jimmy and you will get your bottle of wine for just 1 singular penny. Go check them out. Dry Farm Wines, you guys. It's wine o'clock somewhere. Let's go get some wine. Came in late. Virta Health has a brand new study that they just released a couple weeks ago in the Journal of Behavioral Medicine. Depressive symptoms improve over 2 years of type 2 diabetes treatment via a digital continuous remote care intervention focused on carbohydrate restriction. So we're getting to the meat of the study, all pun intended for ketogenic carnivore diets. Current study. Given the many reasons people with type 2 diabetes may experience mood benefits from a low carbohydrate diet, we conducted a secondary analysis of 2-year data from the ongoing 5-year clinical trial of a continuous remote care intervention to explore changes in depressive symptoms. So yes, this Virta Health study has been going on for half a decade. And so they're taking some of the data points during their study to then pull out and make these studies. So as part of the experiment, participants were coached in carbohydrate restriction. They had the goal of achieving nutritional ketosis. They defined that as any level of beta-hydroxybutyrate in the blood that was 0.5 millimole or higher. The 10-week, 1-year, and 2-year primary outcomes were previously published in other journals. At the 2-year mark, HbA1c had decreased by 0.9% from 7.7% concurrent, with significant reductions in the number and dosage of diabetes medications prescribed. So they've already seen in previous versions of their study that they've been able to pull people off of medications, whereas they were very dependent on medications before, and the disease was getting progressively worse and worse and worse. They were able to not only stop that, but reverse it and get them off of the medications. Weight was also reduced by 12% at the 1-year mark, 10% at the 2-year mark. Inflammatory markers and most cardiovascular disease risk factors also improved. In addition to metabolic outcomes, we assessed the patient's depressive symptoms. They did it at baseline, 10 weeks, 1 year, and 2 years. 3 aims guided the current analyses. First, we assessed changes in depressive symptoms over time via the change in the total symptom severity score and the change in the percentage of participants meeting clinical cutoffs for depression. Second, we aim to identify potential predictors of change in depressive symptoms. Was it the increase in the blood ketone levels? Was it the change in the weight? Was it the change in the HbA1c levels? How about medication use? And then finally, inflammation. They wanted to see and better understand why the changes were occurring. Third, we explored whether participants with evidence of baseline or historical depressive symptoms experienced the same metabolic benefits. Was it because their A1C got better? Did they have a better weight, HOMA-IR score, which is an insulin resistance marker, and fasting glucose? So they looked at those participants and they looked for links between depression and their treatment and engagement. So that's kind of what they were looking for with the current study. Now let's look at the methods of what they did. The participants and procedure. The detailed study design and primary outcomes were already previously published, and the current results are based on a 2-year post hoc analysis using the data that was collected from that same cohort. Briefly, this is a non-randomized, open label study including patients ages 21 through 65 years old. They all had a diagnosis of type 2 diabetes. They all had a BMI, body mass index score, of more than 25. Participants self-selected to receive the continuous care intervention or the usual care. All study participants provided written informed consent. The study was approved by the Franciscan Health Lafayette Institutional Review Board in Indiana, which is where Dr. Hallberg is located. No changes in metabolic parameters were observed in the usual care cohort over 2 years, so we limited this analysis to further our understanding. The 262 participants were provided access to a web-based software application, an app on their phone, and initially advised to achieve nutritional ketosis, get your blood ketone levels, beta-hydroxybutyrate, to 0.5 to 3.0. That was their target. Through sufficient carbohydrate restriction. Initially, they put them on less than 30 grams of carbs a day, but they gradually increased to find their personal carb tolerance and their health goals. Participants used the app to communicate with their remote care team, consisting of a health coach and a medical provider. You know, I keep imagining having an app on the phone and being able to talk to a medical professional while you're going through something like this, where you're doing carbohydrate restriction. I think that's the wave of the future, you guys. Like, how easy would it be, especially if there's like sophisticated ways to be able to communicate, but not always like in person, not always like, you know, FaceTime kind of chat, but be able to leave a message. And then when the doctor has availability to be able to respond, like, I feel like that's where medicine is headed anyway. And it's definitely going to help people with type 2 diabetes. So I think Virta Health is onto something, setting up the protocol for this study, and then it can be replicated, you know, worldwide. Participants use the app to communicate with their remote care team instead of a health coach, consisting of a health coach and a medical provider. So the health coach would be somebody that isn't necessarily a medical professional, but they have lots of nutritional health knowledge. I see several of them on both the Instagram Live and over on Clubhouse right now. So you know who you are. And so you would work alongside a medical provider. The remote care team provides education, support for the dietary changes, behavioral modification techniques for maintenance of lifestyle changes, and then for the doctor, directed medication changes for the diabetes and the anti-hypertensive medication. So your blood pressure will come down. You'll need to come off those medications or at least titrate down on them. All the participants use the app to upload and monitor all their biometrics, including body weight, blood glucose, and their blood ketone levels. Biomarkers allowed for daily feedback to the care team and individualization of patient instruction. How cool is that? They got to communicate, hey, here's how I'm doing. Hey, here's a concern that came up. Hey, help me. And wow, like that kind of intensive approach. And I know they charge a lot of money for this service, by the way. It's not like it's cheap, but man, to be able to actually have that kind of intensive service, I do feel like that if the insurance companies really want to get on board, they would support something like this and they could help lower the costs. And in the end, they're going to win because less patients will be sick and having to expend insurance dollars on diabetes related care if you can actually reverse the diabetes, type 2 diabetes, and give them what they need. It's so simple. Why aren't we doing it? I have worried about that for years. The majority of the intervention was continuous and remote, but participants did complete in-person study visits. That included a physical exam, all the labs, body composition measurements at baseline. They did it again at 10 weeks following the dietary change, and then again at 1 year and 2 years. So they went to visit the researchers 4 times. All the rest of the time was remote. All right. The measurements, baseline demographic and medical characteristics. They looked at age, race, sex, and time since the diabetes diagnosis were obtained from electronic medical records. The medication use, all medication use and dosage, including all the anti-hyperglycemic and antidepressant medications, were tracked continuously by the participants' assigned medical provider in the app. They extracted their medication use data at the specified time points for the number of diabetes-specific medications. They summed the number of medication classes for which they were prescribed medications. Diabetes-specific medication classes include, and forgive me if I slaughter these names because I'm not a diabetologist, but sulfonylureas, insulin, both long-acting, short-acting, immediate-acting, and human separately, thiazolinidiones, SGLT2 inhibitors, DPP4 inhibitors, and GLP-1 agonists. Those are all the popular medications for people with type 2 diabetes. So the depressive symptoms and diagnoses. Depressive symptoms were measured during clinical visits using the 20-item Center for Epidemiological Studies depressive scale for continuous assessment of the depressive symptoms. We summed 14 items for a total score based on prior research, which supports the removal of 6 items. So the 14-item version of this scale had excellent reliability and validity in the evidence in the general population and among those with type 2 diabetes. A sample item is, quote, "I felt that I could not shake off the blues even with help from my family and friends," end quote. Responses range from 0, which means rarely or none of the time, to 3, which is most or all of the time. In the current sample, internal consistency for the 14 items was excellent at baseline. We also looked at clinical cutoffs for depression using the full 20-item CESD since cutoffs were established using that version. We also used a clinical cutoff of 22 based on research that cutoff is most similar to established cutoffs for the Beck Depressive Inventory. You're getting a little bit in the weeds there, but basically they're trying to tell you we have set research that shows these are the ways that you can quantify changes in depressive symptoms, and we're going by the book with those. So they also conducted a retrospective review of participants' external medical charts to identify any depressive disorder diagnoses documented before they got in the study. Among the participants with a depressive disorder diagnosis in their medical charts at baseline, only 1/3 of them met that cutoff at baseline. Among those who met the clinical cutoff at baseline, only 42% actually had a diagnosis in their medical chart. Amongst those not meeting the clinical cutoff, 15% still had a diagnosis. So they were looking, okay, is there pre-existing before they get into this study? It's just smart research. All right, metabolic and inflammatory markers. So they did a blood analysis, and what did they look for? Fasting glucose, insulin, HbA1c, C-reactive protein, which is the inflammatory marker, and a white blood cell count. They were all determined via standard procedure. Insulin-derived HOMA-IR score was also calculated. Weight was also measured at the clinic. How about blood ketones? Beta-hydroxybutyrate was measured via lab testing from blood samples taken during the clinical visits. Additionally, participants were asked to go measure their ketones regularly at home using the Abbott Precision Extra and then enter the values into the mobile app. Ketones were generally entered daily during the first 10 weeks. The percentage of participants who entered ketone values at 0.5 or higher, which would be in nutritional ketosis, was computed to estimate adherence to the carbohydrate restriction. Because if you're not getting 0.5 or higher and you're starting on a ketogenic diet, you're doing something wrong. So they knew that if they were trying to prove that a low-carb ketogenic approach would help with depressive symptoms, we need to know that you're actually adherent to a ketogenic diet. All right, the statistical analysis. First, we examined the assumptions of normality and linearity according to Klein's guidelines. 2 variables, the HOMA-IR score and the C-reactive protein, were positively skewed. So to handle the skew variable, we removed the extreme outliers. So the top 1% of values, they just removed those so it wouldn't skew the results. We chose this approach rather than a transformation because interpretation is more difficult with transformed variables, and results did not differ based on the approaches. Next, the descriptive statistics were computed to characterize the sample. I'm going to skip the rest of this because this is kind of boring stuff and we want to get to the meat of the actual study. Because this is just the analysis. we assume they're going to analyze the data and do it thoroughly. It's great that they put it in the study, and you can definitely go look up this study if you want to look at all that analysis. But let's get to the results, because this is the good part. Participant characteristics. Baseline characteristics of the 262 participants. They had average depressive symptoms. Their severity score was 9.4 at baseline, indicating little to no depressive symptoms on average. This average score is slightly lower than a similar sample of type 2 diabetes in a previous study. About 15% met the clinical cutoff for depression at baseline, whereas 19.5% had any depressive disorder recorded in their medical chart. About 61% of the participants who met the clinical cutoff at baseline were prescribed antidepressant medications, compared to almost 38% in the full sample size. Amongst those who were prescribed the medication for antidepressant, only 25% met the clinical cutoff for depression. Antidepressant use was not systematically adjusted by the study providers and did not change significantly over the study. So, aim number one, remember they had 3 aims. Aim number 1, do depressive symptoms change over time? In the analysis, the overall effect of time was significant, such that depressive symptoms did decrease over time. Specifically, depressive symptoms decreased from baseline to 10 weeks, and then again at 1 year, and again at 2 years. After the initial 10 weeks, there were no significant changes in the depressive symptoms observed. But that's interesting, because a lot of people say, well, I just want to feel better and feel better quick. Well, they did. In that first 10 weeks of the study is when they saw the depressive symptoms get massively better, and then it stayed there at the 1 year mark and the 2 year mark. Huge, because it's supposed to get progressively worse, as they say, but it didn't. Aim 2. What factors are associated with change in the depressive symptoms? Given that depressive symptoms changed between baseline and 10 weeks and thereafter remained statistically unchanged, we explored the predictors of change during that time period only, just during the first 10 weeks. First, we confirmed that all of the hypothesized predictors changed from baseline to 10 weeks. As expected, there were significant changes observed in their weight. On average, they lost 19.1 pounds in those first 10 weeks. Their A1C dropped 1.1% in those 10 weeks. Their beta-hydroxybutyrate levels increased 0.4 over that time. So it started at 0.2 at baseline, and they were able to get the BHB levels up on average 0.4, which got them into nutritional ketosis. Their insulin dose, watch this, you guys, down 58.7 from the 91.2 units per day they were doing previously. A massive drop in insulin dosage. Number of diabetes-specific medications prescribed were down 0.5 from 1.7. White blood cells were up 0.5 from 7.3. The change in C-reactive protein was not yet significant at the 10-week mark. Inflammation can kind of be a lingering marker, and so that's not surprising that at 10 weeks they didn't really see it greatly drop yet. Next, they also conducted 6 separate GLM analyses to assess whether change in each predictor, except for the C-reactive protein, was associated with a change in the depressive symptoms from baseline to 10 weeks. The only significant predictor of change was the percent of reported BHB levels, such that participants who logged a greater percent of their BHB values at or above 0.5 millimole had greater reduction in depressive symptoms from baseline to 10 weeks. Hear me out, you guys. If you or someone you know is dealing with depressive symptoms, get them in to ketosis. That doesn't sound like a hard thing to do. And if it means kickstarting it by doing a fast for a few days, go on a fast for a few days and then eat a carbohydrate restricted diet, a carnivore diet, something that would induce nutritional ketosis, and watch how the depression changes. Why aren't we hearing about this? Why isn't this headline news in health? You're fighting depression, and a lot of people are with all the events of the last 2 years and the things going on in their life, and people are getting manic and their mental health is declined. We need to get everybody at least to consider, at least for the brain health benefits, to get into a state of ketosis. Not because you need to lose weight, not because of anything other than get your brain health to calm down so those depressive symptoms go away.
People ask me, Jimmy, how do you get such good deep sleep? Well, there's a lot of things that I do, but one of the newest things that I recently added is this upgraded magnesium from a company called Upgraded Formulas. Go to their website, upgradedformulas.com, and you can learn all about this nano technology that they use for this particular mineral of magnesium. Again, it's called Upgraded Magnesium, and it's got all the different forms of magnesium in it using the nanotechnology, so it gets absorbed a lot better. Guys, I have seen my deep sleep improve by as much as 30 to 40% simply by adding in this product along with sunshine exposure, darkness in the room, cooler temperature, all of the things that I always have done. So again, upgradedformulas.com is the website. Go check them out.
Aim number 3 in this study: does baseline depression status predict glycemic outcomes? So they conducted 12 assessments about whether depression status predicted weight, HbA1c, HOMA-IR, and fasting glucose over 2 years. When depression status was defined by meeting the clinical cutoff at baseline, the main effect of baseline depression status was not significant for any metabolic outcomes. When depression status was defined by a depressive diagnosis, in the external medical chart, participants had depression because they had higher HbA1c levels. They had higher HOMA-IR scores, which is an insulin resistance marker. They had higher fasting glucose. And again, I say, let's get more ketones in their body, but let's get their blood sugar down. That's what I see from this study. Although participants with a history of depression had worse glycemia and insulin resistance on average, the pattern of change mirrored that of participants without depression, such that glycemia and insulin resistance would improve over time on the ketogenic diet. The average weight did not differ too much between the groups over the 2 years. When depression status was defined as being prescribed an antidepressant medication at baseline, the main effect of depression was significant for those with a higher HOMA-IR score, but not other metabolic outcomes. Participants prescribed an antidepressant at baseline had worse insulin resistance on average over the 2 years, although the pattern of change was similar between the groups. The moral of this story, guys, I hope you're getting out of this study here today, we got to get our blood sugar down. I think that's kind of a well duh for those of us that have been in the low carb space for so long. And get enough ketones. You don't have to go super high in your ketones. They were on average right around 0.5, 0.6 in their blood ketone levels. So kind of a low level of nutritional ketosis. And that changes a switch in your brain to not be depressed, to not have anxiety, to not be overwhelmed. Obviously, you have to do a lot of like mental health work on yourself as well. But man, how powerful is nutrition that it can impact our brains that dramatically. All right, we're at the discussion part of this study. During the first 2 years of an intervention emphasizing carbohydrate restriction for glycemic control, type 2 diabetic participants' mood improved. Depressive symptoms were reduced from baseline to all follow-up time points over the 2-year period. Improvements occurred over the first 10 weeks of the intervention, then they stabilized statistically, although there was a slight regression observed from 10 weeks to 2 years. This is consistent with every other study of low-carb diets and other dietary interventions in that mood did not get worse, and improvements tended to occur early on in the treatment. However, depressive symptoms appear to regress less in the current study than other studies despite the longer follow-up. The continuous care model and the sustained metabolic improvements may have contributed to the overall sustainability of the 2-year period. And that's true. Like, if they had help and they knew that they weren't all alone on an island, that probably helped them. I wonder, and this is just me thinking out loud outside of the study, I wonder if some of the improvements in their depressive symptoms and their mood. Don't laugh at this, you guys, because if you've been on a low-fat diet, you know what I'm about to say. I think the fact that you can have pleasurable food on a keto approach, things like bacon and full-fat meats and cheeses and all the good stuff that really tastes good and makes you feel good, I wonder if that has a little bit to do with why people are able to overcome some of the mood issues, some of the mental health issues. You actually get to have delicious food that's nourishing your body. Every single low-fat diet I ever was on, I felt moody, I was angry, I was like, why do I have to eat this way? And I hated it. Not with a ketogenic diet. So I wonder how much that had to play in this. Although the average change in depressive symptoms was small in this sample of adults who typically did not present with clinically significant depressive symptoms, small changes in depressive symptoms in this population are clinically important as they have been associated with better health outcomes. Furthermore, the decreased percentage of participants meeting clinical cutoffs for depression lends evidence of clinical significance. The percentage of participants who met that cutoff decreased from the baseline to 10 weeks and 2 years, but not at the 1 year. Given the slight regression from 10 weeks to 1 year and then to 2 years, non-significant result at 1 year and higher p-values at 2 years. The most conservative conclusion we can make is that reductions in probable depression diagnoses were limited to just the first 10 weeks, although improvements in the symptom severity score were sustained for 2 years. I wonder, and they didn't do this in the study, I wonder if they took proactive measures to boost their ketone levels beyond that low level of ketosis. Maybe at the beginning of the study, the low level of ketosis was higher than the super low, almost non-existent ketosis that they had, and that's what gave them the benefit. And that at the 10-week mark, all the way to the 1 year mark, had they purposely tried to get them to increase their blood ketone levels through carbohydrate restriction even more, maybe exogenous ketones, maybe all the ways you can boost your ketone levels. I wonder if the depressive symptoms would have continued. I wonder if they stayed at too low of a level of nutritional ketosis that they couldn't feel the full effects. This is just Jimmy Moore talking out loud, kind of offering some counterpoints to why they didn't see great improvements after the 10-week. I think the 10-week was like this honeymoon period of ketosis where their body's like, all right, yes, okay. And then it just dropped off because their body was like, okay, well, if we're going to stay at this low level, we're going to stop the benefits. What if they boosted them to 1.0 to 1.5 as the goal? I think they would have seen far different results. That's just my assumption. I would love to see that studied. We were not designed to target depressive symptoms specifically in this study, but we explored potential predictors of symptoms improvement over the first 10 weeks. The percentage of daily ketone values reaching the nutritional ketosis threshold was the only significant predictor of improvement in depressive symptoms from baseline to 10 weeks. To our knowledge, this is the first ever analysis to leverage daily ketone measurements to estimate the percentage of time that participants were in nutritional ketosis, and then that relationship to improvements and changes in mood over an extended period of time. However, this relationship is consistent with all the current theories regarding the potential role of ketones in stabilizing your mood. Again, in this good old book I wrote 8 years ago, Keto Clarity, I talked all about that's one of the major benefits. And I've often said in my work that if I got no weight loss benefit from a ketogenic diet, I would do it just for the brain health and the mood stabilization effects alone. This relationship is consistent with current theories regarding the potential role of ketones in stabilizing mood. It's also consistent with all the results of previous research, which looked at people with type 2 diabetes who were assigned to the low-carb diet reporting liking how they felt better than participants in the other. Despite literature linking weight, A1C, medication use, and inflammation to depression, changes in these factors were not associated with an improvement in the depression. So it looks like the ketones were the main reason why they felt the changes in the mood. One of the potential explanations for these non-significant results in these other measurements is that qualitative perceptions of health improvement and success may be the biggest drivers of improvement in depressive symptoms. If a qualitative perception of health improvement or psychological experiences that relate to it drive improvements in depressive symptoms, then results may be non-significant because multiple factors impact that perception. For example, someone who experiences improvements in their A1C may perceive health improvement even if changes were not seen in their weight. A different combination of changes may promote this perception of success in each participant, preventing the detection of effects for individual predictors. However, despite this challenge, we may have been able to detect an effect for ketones because they're the most proximal and reliable indicator of adherence to the diet. That's really interesting too, because if your A1C got better but you're not losing weight, are you excited? I would argue most patients would not be excited. I think a lot of patients put a lot of stock in their weight, and so if they don't see their weight changing significantly so, and yet their blood sugar through the A1C level did improve significantly, they're going to put more stock in the weight than they would the A1C. And so while their health might be getting better, that didn't help with their depressive mood because the weight didn't change. That makes sense? I feel like if the weight came off fast, they would be more excited, and maybe that would be an important marker. But I love what they're saying about ketones showing adherence to the diet is probably the best factor. Given the imperfect definitions of depression, it is unsurprising that the results we found varied. While meeting the clinical cutoff at baseline did not predict any outcomes, having a historical chart diagnosis of depression predicted worse glycemia and insulin resistance over the 2 years, blah, 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 blah. Okay, let's look at some of the limitations that they say, the researchers say about the study. First, this was a single-arm exploratory analysis. Although we hypothesized that changes in depressive symptoms resulted from the carbohydrate restriction, our study design does not enable us to draw any causal conclusions. Second, it is multi-component, making it hard to disentangle any potential impacts of dietary versus other components. Third, the sample lacked racial diversity, limiting its generalization of the results to all type 2 diabetics. This sample was also relatively non-depressed, and although this increased generalization of the findings, it made it harder to detect potential effects on depression as non-depressed participants have less opportunity for improvement. That's a good point. And I wonder too if all of this discussion is more of a preventative discussion and not necessarily a diagnostic treatment plan for people with depressive. That would be an interesting follow-up study where they find people with type 2 diabetes and they have a clinical diagnosis of depression, anxiety, whatever, on medications for such, and then put them on a ketogenic diet. I would love to see that study. Finally, although depressive symptoms as measured are very important to assess, there are other diabetes-specific health-related quality of life factors that would be valuable to assess in this context. For example, diabetes distress is thought to be even more prevalent in this population than depressive symptoms and may be more strongly associated with diabetes management behaviors and outcomes. Diabetes distress and other diabetes-specific quality of life factors, such as fear of hypoglycemia and fear of diabetes complications, may be impacted and should receive further attention in future research. So that's the study, you guys. Again, published in the Journal of Behavioral Medicine, January 27th, 2022. The title of the study, if you want to go look it up online, is Depressive Symptoms Improve Over 2 Years of Type 2 Diabetes Treatment via a Digital Continuous Remote Care Intervention Focused on Carbohydrate Restriction. It's always great to find pro-keto, pro-low-carb types of studies. I also read the anti ones here on Jimmy Makes Science Simple, but I love it when we find a pro one, and especially when it's kind of a non-weight loss. So I love this idea that low carb can improve your depressive symptoms. if you have type 2 diabetes. So spread the word, you guys. Let everybody know that has type 2 diabetes and struggling with depression and other mental health issues. Get your ketones higher, get your blood sugar lower, and watch those symptoms go away.
Time to get inspiration from the Living La Vida Low Carb Show. Hey, the livinglowcarbshow.com.
Tired of playing the mask game? Me too. That's why I wanted to tell you about the Unmask. This is a breathable, completely breathable. It covers, you can't even see that it's breathable, but it's breathable. Whether you're going on a plane, having to go into a store and wearing this thing, playthemaskgame.com is how you can get this mask. They come in all kinds of colors and everything. In fact, right there, you can see right through it what it is, but when you're wearing it, it does not look like it's anything different, but it's breathable, baby. Playthemaskgame.com.
Have you experienced the dreaded keto flu? Did you know that most of these symptoms are actually due to your body dumping excess electrolytes? This is where Element comes in. Element is a tasty electrolyte drink mix with everything you need and nothing you don't. That means lots of salt with no sugar. Element is formulated to help anyone with their electrolyte needs and is perfectly suited to folks following a keto, low-carb, or paleo diet. Element contains a science-backed electrolyte ratio, 1,000 milligrams of sodium, 200 milligrams potassium, and 60 milligrams of magnesium, with none of the junk, no sugar, no coloring, no artificial ingredients, no gluten, no fillers, no BS. Everyone needs electrolytes, especially those on low-carb diets, or if you practice intermittent or extended fasting, if you're physically active, or sweat a lot. Add Element today and see how much better you feel and perform. Use the URL drinklmnt.com/Jimmy.